Thank you so much for joining the Engage Community Series. We'll get started in just a moment. And we are now recording. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the 9th episode of the Engage Community Series, a joint initiative of SAAPRI, the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute, and SAAJCO, the South Asian American Justice Collaborative. I'm Jordan Stalker, and I'm joined by the freelance journalist Lakshmi Gandhi, and we'll talk about stereotypes and representation, the media's role in fueling hate. The Engage Community Series allows South Asian Americans and allies to access knowledge, exchange ideas, and discover resources that support equity and justice in daily life. Each month, we'll explore one of 3 core interrelated themes: know your rights, unpacking hate, and civic participation and democracy, through conversations with community experts, advocates, and leaders. And SAAPRI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization established in 2001. Through community-based research and strategic partnerships, SAAPRI strives to deliver impactful policy change at local, regional, and national levels. Dedicated to empowering South Asian Americans by advancing data equity and ensuring that our communities are accurately represented in public policy. And SAAJCO is a civil rights services nonprofit committed to advancing the civil and human rights of the South Asian diaspora in the U.S. through direct legal services, community engagement, and impact litigation. And we'd also like to thank the SABA Foundation, SABA North America, and Indiaspora for their generous support of this series. And of course, all of you for being here. And so this conversation is being recorded so that we can put it out on the platforms for SAAPRI and SAAJCO, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and other places. So please feel free to share once you see those links. And if you have any questions or comments, please drop those in the Q&A or chat functions on Zoom at the bottom, and we'll get to as many as we can. And so with that, I'd like to give some opening remarks to kind of set the stage and think about how we're going to talk about today's conversation about the media's role in talking about violence against South Asian Americans. And so this is part of the Unpacking Hate of the ECS series. And if you paid any kind of attention at all to the New York City mayoral race that just ended and saw the South Asian origin Zohran Mamdani win the election, you likely heard, saw, or read some kind of examples of what we would consider to be clear anti-Asian hate, bias, or violence. And now that he's the mayor-elect, we'll definitely see more criticisms that stem from who he is, regardless of his policies or what his governance plan looks like. And many of you all seen so many of that fake and cruel content circulating on social media. And Second Lady of the United States, Usha Vance, has also been on the receiving end of hateful comments about her faith and upbringing. None of it is constructive, and we don't learn anything from these outbursts. And so these are the kind of things that are going on right now with anti-Asian hate and violence in the media that all of us have encountered, that all of us are aware of, and maybe even some things that have been directed at us. And to think about what we mean by media. And so in addition to working with SAAPRI and SAAJCO, I work at DePaul University and I teach communication and media courses. And when we think about the media, we often think of the news media. And even further than that, we think of political news that's just in the CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, Fox News, ABC, CBS, NBC, the large outlets with long histories, big budgets, and short memories. And so my hope is that we can get beyond the narrow frame of the health of our panelists. And for us, media means news and non-news, because many of us learn things by the entertainment television. And stereotypes exist in those creative media as well. And even those might be the things that we are more familiar with, or not us, than people who maybe are not from the South Asian community. And so they use those things to define and understand, they really do what it means to be South Asian American. And so the goal for our conversation today is really to figure out what happens when people look beyond personal experience and use media, images, and stories to figure out what it means or what it might be like to be South Asian American. And so With that, I'd like to welcome Lakshmi Gandhi officially and ask her to say a little bit about herself and her background as we begin today.
Thank you so much, Jordan, and thank you to SAAPRI and SAAJCO for hosting this conversation and for having me. So, yes, I am a freelance journalist. I've been doing it for a while now since I finished at CUNY's Graduate School of Journalism in like 2008. So, very rough time to jump into the journalism world because of economic upheaval. But after a couple of years, I really found a niche for myself just writing about Asian American and specifically South Asian American communities and pop culture, just through a lot of amazing websites like NBC Asian America and a couple of like specialty websites, and just reported for Tricycle, the Buddhist Review. And even when I was just working for like mainstream papers, I would just find a way to like integrate identity in there, and which was like just a luxury that I know a lot of people don't have. But yeah, so it was just a really, so I've been thinking about just how to portray Asian American and specifically South Asian communities in the media in a nuanced way, basically for 15 years, more than 15 years at this point. And so, yeah, these are questions that I've thought about a lot. And so I'm just really looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. And so, just in case people are not familiar with your work, can you how did you start in journalism? Why it was, of all the things you could do, why was journalism the best way for you to, see your path forward?
Interesting question. It's kind of like a pretty classic story. I was a very, very shy teenager, very shy child, very shy teenager. But my English teacher, in 10th grade, he was the student advisor for the school paper. And so he like encouraged me to start writing for it. And that's really when it all started. Like just somebody being like, you're a good writer. You should write for the paper. And that kind of just started the interest. Grew up surrounded by words and like news. Have very, very like just like news was always in our house. So like grew up in a very loud, extended family with a lot of opinions on all sides of the spectrum about like both politics here and in India. So always like just heard a lot of things, had to like distill a lot of arguments. And so that was just all part of it. And then that continued when I went to college, was very, very involved in my like undergraduate paper. And then when CUNY's journalism school was founded, was right at the time when I was like, oh, what should I be doing with my career? And then just started. That's where it all started.
Great. And do you remember, so what were your first stories that remember fondly? And
Sure. So definitely at CUNY. Um, I think I'll just start with like CUNY, like some adult stuff. But at CUNY, we all had to cover a neighborhood. And this is actually a kind of funny story. So we had like a group project, and it was about we were assigned a neighborhood in Queens, and we were assigned like my little group, which was like all women in their early 20s at the time, was assigned like Howard Beach and Richmond Hill, which like Howard Beach, we'll get to in a second, was kind of famous for being like home of the mafia. Like very like one of the five families was based in Howard Beach. And our advisor used to be an editor for the Daily News, historic New York City tabloid. And as I mentioned, these are like three very young women. And he like gave us this list of stories, and they were all mafia related. And I'm just like, I'm not doing that's ridiculous. But I knew from my because I grew up on Long Island, and with a big Indo-Guyanese community. And I knew from a friend of mine who I grew up with who moved to Queens that like there was a huge Guyanese population in Richmond Hill. And also through her extended family, I knew that there was a huge cricket scene, like just like Caribbean immigrants playing cricket. So I was basically like, I'm not covering the mafia. That sounds terrifying, but we will do a cute little story on cricket in New York City. And that's what we did. And it was like beautiful. But yes, so it was just really just nice. So
And did you get any pushback from kind of inserting that kind of cultural element, either from your collaborators or from the advisor or the community?
I think like it was one of those things. So this was in 2008, right? So now cricket has gotten a lot of attention in the US in that there is like Major League cricket and like with streaming, there's so many channels. Like my family gets Willow TV. I know there's other streaming services, but at the time, like people were going through extraordinary links to follow cricket. Like they were buying like satellite radios and things. So I think the only, not pushback, but feedback from like means like professors who were not familiar with the community was like, oh, I didn't know this was happening. So I think that was just very interesting.
Right. And after you graduated, as you grew into your own and started covering a variety of things, did you, experience any discrimination based on who you were, where you came from, or were you ever assigned kind of the token, you know, Indian or Asian or immigrant or outsider beats and stories that maybe a white colleague wouldn't have been assigned to? Did you ever experience that?
Really interesting question. So I feel like you know journalism, racism in journalism, or whatever you want to call it, for me, it's been like a lot more subtle. I feel like the tricky part about discrimination or like sidelining somebody's career is that you can never pinpoint if that happened or not. So I've never had like an outright moment where somebody said something horrible to me. Because like obviously, one, that would be devastating, but also you would like know it happened. Like it would be clearly a defined moment. But like this more like insidious thing, it's very hard to pin down, no matter what community you're in. So, but the other part of the question is that I also kind of wanted to be that reporter. Like I kind of always also just went out of my way to be a race and ethnicity reporter, not just South Asian communities or Asian American communities, but like other communities of color, say. I liked doing that reporting. And I've had so many conversations with like friends and mentors about whether or not that was a good move or like that interest was a good move. But I was all in and still am all in. Aware of like how that might have sidelined me or made me people think of me as like a certain kind of reporter, but to me the benefits were just more. This is what I wanted to do. So
Sure. And what kind of benefits, what did you learn about those communities, or even in reporting on South Asians, what did you learn that you didn't get at home, that you didn't know? How have you used kind of that to educate yourself?
sure, like I just grew up in a family of like Gandhian socialists, basically. Like, people like the reason this is our surname is because my dad's given name was Gandhi because he was born during like the height of the independence movement. So I was always just like all in like Nehruite secularism. So like this a huge part of my life where like it was just I can't even remember learning about it. It was just there just because of my dad. And that came from his dad, who I sadly did not know super well because he was in India, but it was there. Like that influence was there in my life. Um, so I always was very, very aware. And I think as an adult, I sought out portraying India as the ideal that my grandfather and great grandfather worked towards, which is this like multi-religion, multicultural, multilinguistic society. And always tried to make sure that like when I was covering South like Indian Americans specifically, that like those voices were included. Um, obviously my own background as an American, and then also just like just other things like it like I did the best I could. I'm sure like I've definitely gotten like criticism on Twitter or whatever, but yeah, I like that was always what I strove towards. So it was just always interesting an idea to like explore in journalism. So
Sure. Great. Yeah. And so part of this series is not to laundry list the way that things are terrible and discrimination, but also to see some things about hope and glimpses of improvement. And you talked a little bit about how now you can go directly to timesofindia.com or directly to Hotstar or Willow and get content from India directly and not have any kind of intermediary, or not try to see, is the New York Times going to have a little, 2-column story about this major thing that happened in Queens, the way that we had to maybe 20, 30 years ago. And one thing that, what have you seen change for a positive? Because a negative, of course, is that in the last 8 months, NBC itself has rebranded and removed the Asian American segment, and actually, if you go back and if you've bookmarked any of the stories that were branded as NBC Asian, they're all gone now, and they've been integrated, and the URLs have been changed, and it's not even that they've been redirected; they've been removed, or you have to
Mm-hmm.
find it yourself. And so while we are at a time where we are getting more visibility, there's also major structural things that prevent that visibility from being flourished. But really, the idea, what else has changed in contemporary traditional legacy media coverage for the better in the last 15 years that you've seen?
Really, that's
Or is
really,
there
really
any?
interesting. So what is better, I think, is like access. I think like, well, what you were mentioning, before there were only like a handful of South Asian American journalists or Indian American journalists, and then, for the other countries, just much smaller number. Um, but I think that like I I feel like there is like a thriving Asian American journalist community that is just growing. I do appreciate how people are just really, really working to like it's interesting because like obviously the loss of NBC Asian America was devastating for us. Like, just like we had like a little like Zoom, like I'm still thinking of like planning like a little Zoom reunion for all of my colleagues just to like talk about it, because it really launched so many people's careers. But like, the hopeful thing is like, oh, how can we make sure that these voices are out there without just a siloed vertical? And so will it work? Obviously, it's going to be a lot harder because also just the climate around us is changing so rapidly for the worse. Like, quote unquote, DEI initiatives are just out the window. Everything that started in 2020, like all the race and ethnicity units at CNN, at CBS, at every single race and ethnicity unit that was like launched after the murder of George Floyd has been dissolved, and it's been 10 years. I mean, 5 years. And so that's not hopeful. But I think the hopeful thing is that like people are like, I don't want to say like the hopeful thing is that people are sad about it, but it is that people are sad about it. It just feels like, yes, this like cultural conversation that's starting from the federal government or starting from like, corporations who are running away from diverse, quote unquote, diversity is bad. But the fact that there is like a pushback, that there is like just a thriving scene of news, like on Substack, on like blogs and things like that. So it's very tricky. Like it's hard to say that it's hopeful in that it exists and the appetite is there, but obviously without like corporate funding, like backing from like universities, it's harder. But it is hopeful that like it's not a culture swing, it's a swing against, like it feels like the swing is against the cultural wave, and that is hopeful to me.
Yeah, because there are plenty of things. Again, we can have, or we had, again, NBC Asian America for a long time. We had color lines. We had all these people doing good work for and being visible maybe for the first time or in rare cases. And so representation and visibility are kind of different things. And I think that one of the dangers in ethnic media is that it can be too easily dismissed as being by and for only that community. and then people who are not from that community miss out on important stories, miss out on their own education, and again have to then turn to these larger kind of mediated and creative entertainment ways of explaining or exploring South Asian or Indian identity, right? And that's kind of the second part of the conversation, is going beyond news, talking more about non-news media and so representations as a consumer of media, as I'm sure you are, and as we all are, and because we exist in this world, and so we have to be media consumers. What, and the question that I want to also ask the audience when we get to it in a few minutes is, do you remember the first time you saw someone who looked like you or your family on entertainment television or in a movie, that was, from the US?
No, I do. So, I watched a lot of TV in the mid 80s, but I was a really little kid, so I didn't really understand it. But yeah, so but I remember that there was an Indian student on Head of the Class. That's Twitter, that actor, and we like messaged occasionally. And then there was that awful movie with Fisher Stevens where he like was had the talking robot.
Yeah, the Short Circuit 2, I think.
Yes.
One.
Yes, so there was that, which was on HBO all the time. So I remember that. So obviously, that is a representation by a guy named Fisher Stevens. And I know that when Hari Kondabolu did his movie, I feel like either Hari Kondabolu or Aziz Ansari or both of them have addressed that in their stand-up, how like that representation was out there when they were growing up. And I'm about that same generation too. So so yeah, so the first one was like a white person. But then I feel like in the early 2000s, or the mid 2000s, there was like obviously a ton of sitcom representation as like the best friend. Like, on Big Bang Theory, on like Parks and Recreation, on all those shows, there were like just an Indian guy character in an ensemble comedy. It was almost like a fixture. So that was just very interesting. And then obviously Mindy Kaling, the Mindy Project, and all of her subsequent projects have just been very, very visible as well. So,
Yeah. And why should we care, right? So in the work that I do, even with mostly well-meaning academics, but also some not as well-meaning who are genuinely asking the question, why should you care? Why should we care about the Mindy Kalings? Why should we care about the you know, uh, Abeds? Why should we care about how South Asian Americans are portrayed in large projects, big budget things, if we can have a Substack or have a independent or a small thing? Why should we care about the major representations of South Asian Americans?
so to me, like, pop culture shapes national conversation, but also like shapes who we are. And I know that like, that's kind of it's easy to resist that because you're like, wait, why are a bunch of people in Hollywood or a bunch of people running magazines shaping like my worldview? But it is true. Like I remember clearly things that in like magazines I read as a teenager, in like, or and even just like the famous Office episode, the Diwali episode, that is really why so many people know what Diwali is. Like so I always grew up in big cities. I grew up on Long Island, went to CUNY. Like have lived a very New York based life. I went to school outside Philly. So I've always lived like in cities or suburbs of cities. But I'm like in other places, it's just where you're not seeing people who are different from you or not seeing them as like it's sometimes that is like the only representation. So that's just been really interesting. I remember when I did an article on the anniversary of this novel called Born Confused. And it, as far as I know, it's the first mainstream South Asian novel. It's an Indian American novel, and it's about an Indian American teen girl. And I remember there was this other poet, and she grew up in South Dakota, and this poet was Indian American. And like that Born Confused was in her school library. And she said that that was the first time she had read an Indian character. And then there was a side character in that book who's like a queer Indian girl. Um, and that was the first time she'd seen that representation. And so, like, if that wasn't there in that South Dakota school library, like, what would she have access to, you know? And so it's just an interesting question.
Yeah. And of course, the unfortunate answer for most of my life, most of your life, maybe most of the life of the audience is that representation was Apu on The Simpsons, right?
Right.
And when I talk to my students about it, now that character doesn't exist. And so
Mm-hmm.
rather than take the responsible way and instead of having Hank Azaria voice a brown person, they killed the character off. So you went from a negative, destructive representation to zero. And
Yes.
Hollywood talks about how they can't find the people for the roles, right? And it's a business decision, these kinds of things. But there was one character or actor you didn't mention. And, I remember seeing on Saint Elsewhere, which is an older show from the '80s. There was a bit character who was Indian. That was his maybe first or second role, and he had one thing else, and then he retired. But
Oh,
in 1990, according to the census, there were about 250,000 Indian Americans in California. That was when the Apu character debuted, right? And so chances are that of those 250,000, one of them, maybe even two, wanted to work in Hollywood. And so the idea of not finding the person, doesn't really bear out. And then the question about if we have zero representation instead of negative representation, which one is preferable?
yes. You know what's interesting? As soon as you said Apu, I was like, oh, I feel like I've just either deliberately or subconsciously just blocked it out. Because I remember, because my brother was a huge Simpsons fan, and like, he is probably like the same age as the Simpsons, or maybe like a couple years older than the Simpsons. But I remember thinking as a little kid, I'm like, this is awful. But he wasn't hearing it. But and a lot of people didn't. But I just feel like I didn't get it. Like I did not like that character. But like it's interesting that to this day, like people I know who are like not Indian are still so attached to that character. So it also shows that like people cannot look critically, or it's very hard to look critically at stuff you were introduced to as a child.
Yeah,
And so for a lot of people who like were born in the 80s, of who is something they learned about as a child, and it's just like they're just very attached to. So
yeah,
in my experience.
yeah. And Shilpa Dave talks about how the Apu accent is a character in and of itself. So they don't care about the character; they care about the voice, which is a deliberate characterization, deliberate stereotype, even if we know in our real lives that some Indian immigrants may actually talk like that. But to have that be the only representation means that that is the only thing that we need to know about. And
Before Apu and before the Fisher Stevens movie, there was obviously the Peter Sellers movie.
yeah, yeah,
So yeah, so it's like it's this very consistent, awkward stereotype that has been like just through the years. So
yeah. And it's about the body rather than the culture, rather than the full person, right?
mhm.
And that goes back to journalism, where journalism ought to be, in when it's done well, is about respecting dignity and about communicating human experiences. But when you have a narrow definition of what human experience is, so I talked to my journalism students about it. When was the last time that you saw someone quoted in a Chicago Cubs baseball story who had a last name like Ali or Shah? Those names appear when we talk about things of Asian interest, right? So
Right,
even
it'll be
as
like,
you,
oh, the Chicago Cubs had like Indian night or whatever. Like it
yeah,
would be like, oh, they are celebrating Eid. Let's talk to Ali. Or like it's not just like Ali's just a baseball fan normally. He's just
exactly.
like, he's so it's interesting.
Yeah. And so going back to your own career and going back to the idea of community and belonging, I know that you are very proud of the fact that you are part of the South Asian American Journalists Association. So talk to us who may be unfamiliar with that organization. How has it helped you? What has it helped you with, personally and professionally? And why should those kinds of efforts, that again, if someone wants to define them as DEI, they might, but why is it good? Talk about that.
Sure. So I'm a member of South Asian Journalists Association and the Asian American Journalists Association. Joined SAAJCO first, really because, well, at the time, my one of my professors at CUNY was the president of SAAJCO, and also just it was just so I was involved as long as I've been a professional journalist, and it was just really nice to have a community and to like see other people who are South Asian. So I know that for the generations above me, it was really, really hard for people to get into journalism, not only because it's hard to break in and like a lot of industries, it's very like, you have to like wheedle your way in there be through connections, and that's obviously harder for immigrants, children of immigrants, but also it's harder for the future inside the home, like so it's like, oh, you want to major in journalism, that sounds really unsteady, and then or that sounds very like, yeah, unsteady, not glamorous, low paid. So and it can be all those things, but also it can be really like rewarding, and it's just nice to see other people who have gone through that struggle but also gone through like successes, and you know knowing who to talk to if you're having a hard conversation with an editor, or having like just like, oh, a source request, like, oh, do you know anyone who can talk about baseball fans who are Indian American? A story I've written, and which was always fun. I always like to write about sports fans. But so those kinds of things too, like literal nitty gritty of the job. It's just been nice to have like a community of people to go to for that.
Yeah, good. So how do we do this, right? So how do we get the Alis and the Shahs and the Khannas to get quoted in the Cubs stories? How do we do it?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really hard question. It's I do feel like I know that I'm in a lot of like wider groups. I know that a lot of people, just individual journalists, have been a lot better about like tracking their sources. You know what I mean? Just saying like, oh, who am I quoting? Especially in regards to gender, which is long overdue. But I think also in regards to like culture. So it doesn't make sense to cover a city as diverse in New York and like only have, you know, non people of color as sports fans. That doesn't make sense, especially with baseball. So obviously with basketball and football, like the sources might be quoted for different reasons because like who we expect to be fans. But like with baseball, it's hard. You just have to like really, really work at like not having an expectation of like who the fan is in your head. If you're thinking, oh, this dad on Long Island who's a dad of three, because clearly there is that dad. It's easy to not easy, but there's. I'm sure there's like if you go to Yankee Stadium, you could find three dads of three who are like white or like not person of color, but like just think like, oh, who is a baseball fan? Like, who am I not quoting? Like, what am I missing from like what I bring to the picture, what I'm already bringing to the story? And that is just personally just an area of growth, right? Or it's just interesting. Like, oh, what if it's not the same story that's been written about Yankee Stadium since whenever, like the past 100 years? But how can I make this different? And that just requires just like internal work, but also just you know making more of an effort.
Yeah, I think the companies and the organizations, whether the media companies or not, that have done well in visibility, representation, and support don't make it. Here's the special story about these really strange Indians who also like baseball. But it's,
Mm.
again, integrating into, the complete story about baseball coverage, right? And so making
Right.
it not a silo, making it part of, the daily beat reporting, your daily source updating, and making it not seemed forced or seemed artificial, and that journalists and media creators of all kinds,
Mhm,
professors, have a huge opportunity and a huge responsibility for that.
mhm. Well, it's really interesting because there have been a couple of like in recent years Indian Americans drafted by the MLB. So there was Kumar Rocker who has a Black American dad and an Indian American mom. So I actually wrote a lot about him because like just there was this he was initially drafted by the Mets. He's now on the Rangers because it didn't work out and drafted by the Rangers. But when he was drafted by the Mets, there was an enormous amount of excitement in South Asian communities here in New York. And that was just a really fun story to do because I got to talk to people who were just fans their whole lives and like they got to talk about like, you know, what it's like playing team sports and like having their families there and just like having that representation. And so it was just a really interesting story because like there are so many sports fans in Indian American communities, not just of like, cricket, which we talked about earlier, but just like there's a culture about like watching sports, talking about sports that hasn't been represented. And it's just been really like, so that was just an interesting way to like talk about it. So really you need that news peg. It's like, how do you do it when there isn't an Indian American drafted is the trickier question. But that's the trickier question with all stories because your editor will always say, like, okay, but why now? Like, is there somebody in the news? Is there like give me a reason why we should run a story about Indian American sportsmen right now. And it's like, if there's no Diwali night or if there's no Kumar Rocker, it's like you have to think a little harder and you have to really make that sell, and that's harder. So,
Did you find that a lot in your career? More
I
than
mean,
more than you expected, or that wouldn't have been asked in the way that was if it were somebody else, some other group?
no, because I do get it. Like, I mean, you are trying to point your reader towards something, you know? So it's like, oh, if you can say, oh, there's like this novel about an Indian American, like, it's just easier to have like that news pack, that pitch that you can say, like, here's why I'm writing about this, you know? So,
Great. What else? What have you been thinking about since you were invited on the panel, or maybe even since 2008, that you've seen in the industry, whether again the journalism industry or the greater media industry? What what advice do you have for us? What things do you want us to think about? What do you want us to do?
sure. So I know that we've talked a lot about like, being an Indian American or South Asian American journalist and like having conversations with like people outside of the community about like editors who might be outside of the culture. But I also feel like we need to talk about how Indian Americans like, like to make sure that as an Indian American, you're not perpetuating stereotypes in your own reporting. So like I mentioned, like are all of your sources a particular religion with a very specific worldview? So it's like, who are you leaving out, Or even the most basic example. So there's often, so next month in January, there'll be like oh, here's our list of Indian American books to look forward to throughout 2026. And so I feel like when those lists are written by like non-Indians or even Indians, like because it's really, really easy to guess if somebody's Indian, like by their last name, if it's like a Hindu name, it's really easy to fill the whole list with those kinds of names. But then you just have to dig a little deeper, like, because there's so many incredible like Indian Muslim novelists right now. Tanya James, an Indian Christian novelist, like, so it's like, how do we make sure that we're not as simple as in a compilation list, not like really narrowly defining what it is to be Indian, you know? And it's like, oh, there are other people who are like doing the work of messing up the representation, but I don't want to like say that internally we're not perpetuating certain myths or stereotypes or harm through like unintentional things.
Sure. Yeah, that's another question that we could talk about is covering the community when the story is negative. Have you had to deal with that? That is, here is the news that happened. I have to report it straight. And if when I report it straight, that will be another notch for someone who wants to do violence to my community to say, see, I told you so. Have you had to go through that or talk about what you would do in that situation?
Because I've always been more of an arts culture, pop culture journalist. Like I'm the one who, when given the choice of doing the mafia, I'll do like the fluffy sports story. But you know what I mean? But I also feel like even covering pop culture for me has been like a landmine because I feel like sometimes community members bring a level of personalization to the story that understand, but it can be really, really like hard. So we mentioned Mindy Kaling. Um, there's a part of her first book I really don't like. It's like it's an aside. She makes a joke about like acid attack victims. It's like literally at the end of a chapter. It's like one line. But I remember reading it and I'd be like, "What? This is wild." And so I wrote about it once for Brown Girl magazine, which is pop culture magazine geared towards very young women. And like, if you look at, it's been a few years now, but if you look at the Facebook comments, it's like, shame on you, like, what's wrong with you? To me, not the person who, to the person who wrote about the acid attack joke, not the person who made the acid attack joke. And so, it was just very interesting. It was like, oh, like, there was a very, let us have this like cool girl with the book, with the sitcom. And I understand, but sometimes it's like the personalization can be very overwhelming.
Sure.
So,
The danger of the representation at any cost, right?
yes.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, now I think we've got a few live participants, and the question that we were talking about how we want to open up to the audience. Your experience reading about yourself, your community, and if you work in media, how have you considered these questions? But even if you have not worked in media, those in the audience, when was the first time that you saw or read someone who maybe kind of looked like you or could have been a family member? And talk about that experience and what you learned from it. And so if you're able to, you can put your comment in the chat box and I can read it out. And while they're thinking about that, going back to, again, arts and culture and media and culture, there's been plenty of things in the last couple of years, but again, like with most things, the kind of vibrancy of the post George Floyd era is kind of waning, and corporations are now finding it easier to not care as much. And that also means, again, that some different types of media outlets don't care as much. Different types of shows aren't being greenlit as much. But what do you feel as a viewer is more important? Again, this is a question I put to my students. The idea of, is it better to have the Patels of Pittsburgh, or is it better to have there, whereas the cast itself is entirely South Asian? Or is it better, more productive, healthier for everybody that you have one or two members of an ensemble cast, of South Asian origin? Which one do you think for us in our, to help with American cultural knowledge and education? Which do you want to see more of?
I feel like I want to see, if it's an ensemble cast, I want the character to be like fully well-rounded. And so like obviously the Big Bang Theory is in general not the most highbrow entertainment out there. But it was the number one sitcom in the country for 10 years. So I feel like, but the Indian character was literally like afraid to talk. Like literally, that was his storyline. He was afraid to talk. By the end of the story, by the end of the series, he's the only one without a romantic partner. His future is uncertain in terms of like everyone else. Like if the show has defined growing up as like getting partnered off and having a career, and like that storyline for him was unresolved. So you're just like, oh, that's odd, out of like, and then so I think like, and it's also like who's in the writers room as well. So it's like, oh, are these characters being well written by people from the community and being done like so I also want people like behind the camera to have jobs, and that's almost as like more important because like the majority of jobs like an ensemble cast is like 8 people, but behind the scenes it's like 200 people. So it's like, oh, are we in those rooms? And is the representation every step of the way? So that's just a very interesting thing to think about, and like how can we support that? So I think that when it is a South Asian showrunner writing from their own experience, like at least like they are represented at the top and presumably can decide the makeup of their writing room and like can have community members and the authentic experience reflected on screen.
Yeah, and as audience members, we deserve to ask the question, who asked for this? And so if we know, especially in creative media, that everything is made up, literally everything is made up. Decisions were made, lots of money was spent, and I'm sure many people worked very hard on all these things. And so the question we got to ask is, if everything is made up, why did they make it up like this? Yeah.
I always think of like Mad Men, like there were like, to jump to a different community, but there were like very senior Black American executives on Madison Avenue at the same time Mad Men was taking place. And like Matthew Weiner, the creator of Mad Men, created this world fictionally in this century that doesn't have that. So it's like, oh, why are we dreaming of this world that's less diverse than the real world, So
Yeah. And again, a different panel, I would have a different response, but just, again, there are certain reasons. Again, part of the reason is that his own experience didn't incorporate that apparently, and so
right, right.
Mad Men was so much kind of a response to his father, and that was one of the things. But again, it doesn't take too much looking to find, right? It works just a little bit
Yeah.
hard. Yeah. Oh, great. Well, this has been a fun conversation for me, and hopefully it's been cathartic, or at least liberating somewhat for you to talk about what you've seen, what you experienced, and what you've joyfully contributed to. So again, you are one of the leading voices, representing the community and behind the screen and that way. So thank you so much for your work. And what are you working on right now?
So right now I'm actually just I've been contributing to the History Channel, like for like digitally. So just doing a couple of projects for them, and then actually I'm taking a break from full-time journalism. So I work for a nonprofit, but because it's been a hard couple of years for for journalists. So.
Yes, very much. Well, great. Well, thank you so much. And we'll kind of officially end the conversation here. I just want to kind of have a couple of housekeeping notes for the future. And so thank you again, Lakshmi Gandhi, for joining us and giving us your experience and your ideas and suggestions on how, again, we can use the media to be sites of joy instead of laundry listing terrible problems. And, SAAPRI is doing a live survey to better understand immigrant experiences. And so when you get the recording link to this webinar, you'll also get a link to the survey. So please take those and distribute those and encourage your friends to do so. And then we'll also be compiling some takeaways and notes from today's conversation and emailing those as well. So those will be in the inbox to those who registered very soon. And then upcoming, our 10th episode of the Engaged Community Series is going to be on January 15th, 2026 at 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central Time. And it's going to be Voting Rights 101, Bridging Gaps in Community Participation. And again, the way to register for that is going to be sent to you. And so thanks again to everyone for being a part of this. And we look forward to seeing and talking with you on January 15th. So this concludes the official part of the ECS episode 9.